Now, this is the first event that CBD will be holding with the Australian Business Council in 2022 that covers key considerations for companies looking to expand in the region. Now, as we can all understand, especially if you have had a footprint in the UAE, there are nuances that pop up across all the GCC states when you're looking to expand. As much as you can do some Googling and ask for some advice within the UAE, if you're looking to, say, go into Saudi, Bahrain, there are nuances on the ground that you need to be aware of. So this event is quite key and pivotal because, as we all know, Saudi has been grabbing quite a few headlines in the last 24 months. I actually went on a foreign direct investment trade mission with the Dubai government to Australia 3 years ago. Seems not that long ago, but COVID got in the way. And I still remember the Australian ambassador to Saudi saying, I come here every year. I usually don't have a lot to say. Saudi is Saudi. It's always had its, its known norms. But he said, it seems to be changing fairly quickly at the moment. I actually find myself quite excited about presenting. Now, in the last 3 years, boy, has that sped up. And it is very important if you are looking at the Saudi market, which is, let's not skip it, it's 3 times the size in population as the UAE. You should be looking at it if you've got a business in the UAE or anywhere else in the GCC, and you should be looking at it very closely. It's not just where the market is now, it's what they're planning to do in the future. So I would like to thank 3 guest speakers today, just for putting the time aside to focus on what we would consider 3 key areas that you would need to deep dive into if you are looking at setting up in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The first speaker will be Lee McMahon. He's a principal at Support Legal, and Support Legal has been running for a number of years with a very new approach to the legal services sector. Lee has had a number of clients expand into Saudi, so he can give you good fun. He can give you an insight into what you should be looking at in terms of structuring and how the business can be expanded into Saudi Arabia. The second speaker will be Wayne Merrick, who is the managing partner of CBD Corporate Services. Wayne is going to be giving you an insight into the practical considerations and the process itself of setting up. The UAE has made leaps and forward in terms of the speed in which you can set up a company. I know onshore we've been able to do it within a day at times, given the right structure, of course. In Saudi at the moment, you will need to have some patience as it will take some time. So Wayne's going to be covering that focus area and other key considerations such as Saudiization and nuances around hiring Saudis effectively. Third speaker, we have Sumit from KPMG. Sumit is going to be talking about the fun word that's only just popped up into our lives inside the UAE, the tax considerations. It's quite interesting that the headline grabber in the last 2 weeks has been the UAE implementing corporate tax in the coming times, but most GCC countries have had tax for quite a while. And I think it's going to be good to get an insight from Sumit. Again, just probably scratching the surface, I would say, but he will at least give us an indication today what you should be ready for. And I think that the large message will be good accountants and a decent auditor. So I would like to just wrap up from my side as quickly as possible so we can get the speakers up in front speaking today. The format of the event will be each speaker will give a brief presentation. It'll be 10 to 15 minutes long. We are inviting each speaker, if they feel like they want to dive a little bit further in any details during their presentation, to do so. The Q&A at the end will be taken up if there are any specific questions from anyone in attendance to ask. We may run over time depending on how deep we need to go with it. But if you have a very specific question regarding a business that you have, that you're looking to expand into Saudi or existing in Saudi, then I would say maybe weigh up whether or not you have a general question which you can cover your specific query, or come and speak to the one of the speakers afterwards, just so we can take up the maximum time for all the attendees. So without further ado, I will ask Lee to come up, and he'll be the first speaker talking about the legal considerations.
Thanks, Carl. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lee McMahon, and so I set up Support Legal about 5 or 6 years ago. I've been in the region for 14 years. I've worked in private practice, international law firms, in semi-government in-house in the region, and obviously in the last 5 years running my own law firm. The movement into Saudi, as Carl touched on, is growing exponentially. 3 or 4 years ago, when someone said they were going into Saudi, you'd often have to have a big budget, a lot of patience. You'd have to think long and hard around whether it's worth it. A lot of people, particularly if they're in services or products, would often find themselves doing some kind of licensing deal, distribution arrangement, just because it was a lot easier to do that than to go in themselves. You would notice now that it's not, when I say easy, let's put easy from a spectrum. Easy is, one day you've got a company, but it's definitely open and it's definitely very possible, and timeframes around setting up have dropped considerably. It's an opportunity for everyone looking to go into Saudi, a bit like where the UAE was 15, 20 years ago. If you're early on the ground and you found your own niche and you got there and you understood and you went through some of the more sort of early stage pain points, then that's the opportunity for you to grow very, very big. As you know, in the region, Saudi is the largest country by a long way. So when we talk about a regional's population, they control the largest portion of that. The challenge of the GCC, unlike other parts of the world, this is the challenge that Europe had many, many years ago, was that you'd see a large population, but every time you crossed a border, you would have a whole nother level of costs and implications to cross into that particular jurisdiction. That's still the case in the GCC, but it's getting easier and easier, and a lot around structuring. So previously, just even knowing whether you could get in there and not have a Saudi partner was something a little bit more complicated. You have to get a lawyer or someone to do an analysis as to the kind of category you were going into. Now, essentially, everything is open to you unless you're on the negative list. The negative list is reasonably clear, and that doesn't mean that there are other arrangements you can work with people in a negative list, but it's just that it's a lot more open for the vast majority of businesses that I'm seeing, particularly foreign-owned businesses looking to enter into Saudi. If you have any percentage of foreign investors in any structure, even through a joint venture, you're deemed a foreign company for the purpose of Saudi. And it'll be touched on in relation to tax, but most importantly, this will trigger the requirement with the Ministry of Investment to get this foreign investment license. Now, for those who've tried before, you may have noticed that many years ago, this could take 6 to 12 months. This is down to sometimes 3 to 4 weeks. So it is much faster. I've seen it for startups, for early stage companies to go very, very quickly. Okay, so they're definitely trying to open up, and they're definitely keen on getting people into the country. Limited liability companies are the most common, okay, setting up an LLC. And obviously there are other things like joint stock companies, which I probably would say that for most of you, you're probably not going down that path. Otherwise, looking at branches as well from perhaps your entity that you've got over here in the region, or if you're from another country around the world, looking at doing a branch. Now, when I started, I said that it's open. It's not necessarily easy, but it's not now impossible to set up. There are many, many steps involved in setting up, and Wayne will touch on this later. But just be aware that the process will require a lot of steps, a lot of documents, a lot of notarization, legalization, a lot of translation of documents. And you just have to be aware that it's not just a matter of saying, how do I pay the money? Do I fill out a form? And I've got a company. It is a process, okay? So just be aware of it and allow for that time. Don't try and sign a contract with a government entity and saying, I'm planning to be set up in a month, because I think you'll be, that's something you want to be preparing now for contracts you want to do, sort of in 3 to 6 months. Next slide. So limited liability companies, it's very similar to here. You can have a single manager, okay? So the same as the LLC, or you can obviously have 2 or more managers or a board of managers. So it's very similar to the way that a board of directors would work in a more common law jurisdiction. Joint stock companies must be managed by a board of directors. Again, what are joint stock companies? They're largely sort of borderline public companies, or the early stage of a public company, often when government might become a shareholder. So it's often something that you'll see that's a little bit more regulated and a little bit more driven on larger projects. Now, there's no mandatory presence to go into Saudi to do a lot of this. A lot of this will be stemmed around getting power of attorneys notarized and legalized, and to do a lot of the sort of structuring on this side of the fence. In certain professional activities, so I get a lot of inquiries from services, people saying, hey, I'm an engineer, I'm an architect, I'm a landscaper, or something where they might have a professional background. There is a requirement to show evidence of that professional background, no more than you may have had to do if you had a sole establishment here in the early days of setting up in the UAE. So it's just something that you need to show evidence of having. There is a requirement to put the share capital into the bank account and setting up in Saudi. So this is not one of those situations where they say it, they never show evidence of it, and you've got a company set up. So you do need to have the cash sort of sitting there and need to be aware of that early on. Next slide. The key thing I want to talk about is more around your options and structuring. So often what happens is a lot of the time people get a little bit nervous going in 100% into Saudi. That's not necessarily something you should be nervous about, but it might be the fact that you want a soft land. It might be that you want a local partner and you want to have the local partner that might already have real estate, might have some of the services you require, might have already the logistics warehouses ready to go. You might decide to do a joint venture. You might go in some kind of percentage. Now, when you do that structure, often the case will be is that there'll be a tendency to say, let's set up an entity of which you will become our shareholder in Saudi. Now, my recommendation as a lawyer is often it's about structuring it in a place that allows neither party to have the benefit of that particular jurisdiction. So hence why we often say Abu Dhabi Global Markets. For those of you who are not familiar, Abu Dhabi Global Markets is the Abu Dhabi version of the DIFC in Dubai. And it is a pure English law jurisdiction, and it has a concept called a special purpose vehicle or a holding company, similar to Cayman or BVI. And the benefit is very cost effective. And this is where you would do your joint venture with your Saudi partner. So you would do your shareholders agreement, you would have your shares there, it would be governed by English law, and it has its own courts. And that allows that entity to then to own either the Saudi entity, if that's the only purpose of the structure, or it might be the fact that you want to restructure your group in your region, all of your entities, and maybe perhaps get an investor at your holding company level, and then invest both into Saudi, UAE, and maybe other GCC regions. So ADGM has been a very successful place to structure. So when you enter into Saudi, it's not just thinking about Saudi, it's thinking maybe about your wider structure. There are other opportunities as well, other than going directly into Saudi. You could do a soft landing around licensing or distribution or agency arrangements, which are all fine. But remember that the risks always are that if it goes bad, you've got a brand that has been tested in the market and may not have had maybe the service level that you would have expected. So you need to be making sure that you're picking the right partners. But picking the right partners is no different to what it was 15, 20 years ago in the UAE. There's a lot of benefits, particularly for those where the country is very new to foreign investment in terms of at volume. They've always had foreign investment, but the volume in which small and medium-sized enterprises are setting up in Saudi is happening more and more now. So you might find that a good partner can help you ease into a market that allow you to expand faster. But picking these partners is very important, okay? It's a bit like marriage. The divorce is going to not be great if it goes poorly. So you've got to pick wisely. I would say that the other options that you can look at as well is, which is next slide. Historically, going into Saudi, because it was so complicated, it was often a situation where people would set up a structure where they would get 100% owned Saudi to own a structure, perhaps over here in the UAE. And then they would be able to then trade in the UAE, in Saudi via some kind of nominee arrangement. As you know, with nominee arrangements, for any of you who have got an LLC or a limited liability company, onshore company in the UAE, these structures are very common. Okay, you'd have a 51% shareholder with that person is there by name and passport, but actually you are the beneficiary of all the profits and all the power over that company. Recently, as of last year, the Saudi government was very aware that this was happening more and more. And so they've introduced a revised and new anti-concealment law. This anti-concealment law is designed to sort of kind of nip this and stop this from happening at the level in which it was, because they were ultimately saying, look, we'll open it up to foreign investors, but we want you to come in and do it yourself, not go behind a Saudi. You'll notice that one of the key reasons is tax. There is a tax differential between a foreign investor and that of a local. So, you know, the window there is 7.5% tax differential. So you can imagine from a Saudi perspective, you would be defrauding them of tax, which will be touched on a bit later. But the main thing about the anti-concealment law is because they do generally want to get their foreign investment up, and they want to be able to have that opening up in Saudi. So the key thing with this is around controlling. So what's the controlling element? So you have the benefit of decision-making. You've maybe funding the business. You may be the beneficiary of the profits. Okay, any of these kind of things are a test on concealment in Saudi. What's interesting is that the fines are very, very high. There have been no known prosecutions yet, but that's because basically they're giving a window of probably 12 to 18 months to allow most people to sort of fix the structure if you're already doing it. So they're giving a sort of a bit of an opportunity for people to clean up their structure and go in directly. There's even rewards for whistleblowers, offering up to 30% of the collected fines. So that can be quite, quite lucrative for those who are out there to dob in other people's structuring. 5 million reals, imprisonment 5 years of trying to structure this way. But again, I would say to you that this anti-concealment law has come in at a time where if this came in 4 years ago, it would be, you would have got to a stage where you'd be thinking to yourself, how else am I going to do this? Whereas now there is another way, and you can absolutely go in and set up directly into Saudi. So that sort of sums up my talk. I think the key thing here when you're going into Saudi is to consider your wider structure. So for example, if you do have other shareholders and you are looking into Saudi, don't replicate the same structure you might have already here and then go and get a subsidiary. Think about your overall structure and use this as an opportunity to structure it right. As you know, for any of you who have done any structuring changes of your company, every time you make a change, it's costly and it takes time. And so you really want to do it once and do it well. So if you are going to go and you're going to go beyond the UAE, consider a wider structuring look at the company setup so that you're ready for future investment and future expansion into the further region. Thank you, everyone. Just passing on to Wayne Merrick.
Thank you, Lee. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, to everyone here and also to those online. First of all, just to introduce myself, Wayne Merrick, Managing Director for CBD Corporate Services. We provide market entry, company formation, licensing and compliance services throughout the Middle East, headquartered here in the UAE, but also in Saudi, Qatar and Oman. So just following up from Lee's presentation, I'm going to give more sort of a practical guide to registering an entity in Saudi. Just to start with, just going through some of those legal entity options that Lee did mention. First being the most popular route to market, which is a limited liability company, LLC, where the liability is as per the capital in the entity. The second option is a branch for foreign company, which is very similar to what we have here in the UAE. It's an extension of the foreign party company into the jurisdiction. One difference would be you don't need to appoint a local Saudi national as the service agent, which is something you traditionally had to do here in the UAE up until recently. And the third option is the commercial agency, whereby you're not setting up a legal entity per se, you're appointing a local agent to represent your product in that market. And as Lee said, that was been quite a popular route in the past, but does come with its own risks and challenges, particularly if the relationship breaks down, and it may cause an issue for your brand and product in that market in the future. So it has to be considered what is the right type of setup for your business in the kingdom. The key consideration for setting up in Saudi starts with the business activity you require, the licensed activity, as per the ISIC list, which regulates the registration of all the business activities that are available. There are various license types. I've just given some examples there on the left-hand side, from service, industrial, commercial, professional, real estate, and engineering. I just wanted to point out a few examples in terms of considerations regarding activity. One would be those that are trading. Trading activities, you'll note on the right-hand side there, that one of the considerations, if you want to be 100% foreign owned, the minimum share capital, which must be deposited prior to incorporation, is 30 million Saudi riyals. For real estate, the total cost of the project must be no less than 30 million Saudi riyals. And for anybody that is looking to establish an engineering office, the applicant must be licensed in at least 4 countries outside of the kingdom. Next slide, please. There are certain business activities that require a mandatory Saudi participation, where there will be a minimum shareholding required of a Saudi national or an entity fully owned by Saudi nationals. I've given a few examples there. One would be in insurance, where the minimum shareholding of a Saudi national must be 40%. Real estate is also 40%, and public transport services 30%. There is also a negative activity list, which is solely exclusive to Saudi nationals and the KSA government, and therefore does not enable any foreign investment. And I've just given a few examples there, which are oil drilling, recruitment, and security. So in terms of foreign investors setting up in the kingdom, I'm just going to go through some of the sort of high-level steps associated with getting registered. As Lee mentioned, the first step, an application needs to be made to MISA, which is formerly known as SAGIA, whereby you're applying for a foreign investment license, ensuring that it meets the criteria associated to the business activity that you are applying for. If you have an activity, such some of the activities that require a minimum share capital, you can open a bank account at that stage to deposit the capital, but you will not be able to operate that bank account until later in the process, once the general manager or the authorized signatory has got their Iqama, typically known as their visa. The issuance of the commercial registration after the MISA license has been issued is from the Ministry of Commerce. The commercial registration is the equivalent that we know it here in the UAE as your trade license. And after the commercial registration has been issued, you then also need to get registered at the Chamber of Commerce. That will also include the authorized signatory. Typically it's your general manager, verifying their signature, which will be then within the system for all government authorities. Following that, there are a number of government authority registrations that are required after the commercial registration and the Chamber of Commerce certificate has been issued. One of those is to register with the Ministry of Labour to enable the company to apply for quota and to get visas, which is a very similar process to here in the UAE. And there is also the GOSI registration, which is the General Organisation for Social Insurance. And both for Saudi nationals and for foreign nationals, there is a contribution that needs to be made every single month. Different percentages for Saudi nationals than there is for foreign nationals, which includes sort of insurance benefits and also pension contributions. Another registration is the Madad portal, similar to here in the UAE in Saudi. There is a wage protection system. The Madad portal is effectively enabling the company to be registered for those payroll services and comply with the WPS, which is defined as ensuring that every Individual is being paid on time every month. So MEEP will go into a little bit more detail this later, but every entity also must register with the General Authority of Zakat and Tax, also known as Gazette. There's also the registration with the Kiwa and Mokim portals, which is effectively immigration registrations. There's the application for the General Manager's Visa, which is also known as the Iqama. And there is a process regarding that in terms of documentation that does differ from what we see here in the UAE. And every entity will need to procure commercial premises in order to obtain their municipality license. And similarly, that will be linked somewhat to the number of visas that you would require for your quota, which will be linked to the commercial premises you have to ensure it's fit for purpose. One of the typical questions we get when we've assisted international companies and investors with setting up in Saudi Arabia is, how long is it going to take? And it does vary subject to the business activities that the company is applying for and to be licensed for. But I would always say to any company looking to set up there, you need to leave a lead-in time of approximately 3 months, minimum. Next slide, please. I'll continue. Saudization. I think one of the differences between KSA and the UAE would be in regards to the programs and the criteria for Saudization versus Emirization. Saudization requires the employees in the private sector with over 9 employees to hire a certain percentage of Saudi nationals. But importantly, any international company investor looking to go into the kingdom needs to hire a Saudi national. And typically that would be your first hire. And I'll come on to why in a second in regards to the Nitakat system. The purpose of Saudization is to increase the number of Saudi nationals that are working in the private sector. And the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development, also known as Ministry of Labour, is very much targeting an uptick in the following sectors, which is effectively around sort of the marketing sector and also healthcare. And there are upcoming mandates in the next few months in regards to that. There are some examples of some job titles there that also have been highlighted that now are going to be restricted for foreign nationals moving forward, from translation to data entry jobs, for storekeeping and secretarial roles. Those job roles, job titles are going to be restricted for foreign nationals moving forward. And there's going to be a criteria, particularly in the sectors of marketing and healthcare, to see an uptick in Saudi nationals in the private sector. The Nitakat system is a colored zoning system to categorize companies into compliant zones, which is platinum and green. And then there's a non-compliant zone, which is red. And just on the next slide, next slide, please. In the next slide, effectively, your adherence and compliance to the Saudization program will put the entity into one of 3 categories, as I say, platinum, green, or red. Whichever category your company sits in will determine whether you can recruit and hire foreign nationals under the entity. Can you get them from the international market? Can you get them from the local market? Can they therefore transfer from another company to your company? So it's a critical consideration, the Saudization program, for any international company and investor. And as I said earlier, I think in terms of market entry, the hiring of a Saudi national as your first employee would ensure that you go to the top grading system, and that will assist you with hiring foreign nationals thereafter. We have seen a sort of a large demand for new inquiries from here in UAE about setting up in Saudi in the last 12 to 15 months particularly. It is typical that those companies, those directors, managers, employees will naturally compare doing business here in the UAE with Saudi and feel that it could be very, very similar. Absolutely, there are some similarities, but there are some distinct differences too. As Lee went through in his presentation, the foreign ownership is one of those. Saudi, for the majority of activities, has enabled 100% foreign ownership, whereas here in the UAE, up until recently, in most cases, you would need a local partner or a local agent. You would have seen through my presentation, there are many more registrations required in Saudi with government authorities than there are in comparison to here in the UAE. And that ultimately will have an effect on time frame for setting up the business. As Carl said, here now can be done extremely quickly in terms of setting up a company. You need to leave that sort of at least 3-month window to set up your entity in Saudi Arabia. The criteria and applicability of the Saudiization program, as I went through, and the requirement to consider hiring a Saudi national is very, very important for entering the market. That isn't such a requirement here in the UAE. There is, of course, a program, but the criteria is distinctly different and typically is triggered after there's a certain number of employees that have been hired. The wage protection system is similar in both, as I touched on earlier. And the final key consideration at the moment is regard to tax. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to my fellow presenter, Samib, who will go through the tax overview. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne. Hi, so just to introduce myself, I'm Samib Uchil. I'm a director with KPMG, run international tax for about 11 years. Was earlier based in Mumbai and New York and moved to Dubai about a year back. I think before we dive in, one housekeeping point, just a request, if we don't take pictures of the KPMG slides because we have some risk management issues. So before we dive into the slides, just some brief background. I mean, as probably Wayne left out, I think it's a very interesting phase that we are in the tax world. Yes, you've been reading news about UAE introducing a corporate tax, which is path-breaking. But just to give some background before we go into Saudi, this is not really a UAE-driven change. It's a global change, and there are about 137 countries who signed up to something that we call a global minimum tax regime. Now, what this seeks to do is specifically countries like the UAE, which did not have a tax historically, and the BVI or the Cayman, this regime, and especially it aims the larger groups, like groups in excess of 750 million euros turnover. It says that you need to pay 15% tax on your profits globally. Now, whether you pay taxes in the UAE at 15% on your UAE profits, or there are mechanisms if UAE does not introduce certain rules, you can pay taxes very well in the US or in the UK, wherever it may be. How does it impact Saudi? I'll come to that in a bit. But to kind of start with, Saudi probably amongst the GCC countries has the most, I'll say, aged tax regime. I mean, most sophisticated as compared to the others, because UAE is just introducing. Bahrain doesn't have a corporate tax regime as yet. Oman and Qatar are newer regimes. Saudi has a kind of a dual corporate tax system. It's dependent on who your shareholders are. So to the extent you have GCC shareholders, they fall under the zakat regime, which is kind of, it's a 2.5% tax kind of on net profits, but there are certain other adjustments which are otherwise not there in the first principles of tax. I mean, it depends on your retained earnings, depends on your net contributed capital. There are adjustments of fixed assets. And for any foreign entity or foreign shareholder holding shares in Saudi, you pay a 20% tax, which is regular contribution. I've just given an example, like the question that will come up is, what if there's a JV where there are certain GCC nationals and certain non-GCC nationals? In such a case, in the example that I've given, the Saudi shareholder will pay, basically, let's say the Saudi company has profits of 100, I'm oversimplifying it. To the extent of 51, you will pay zakat at 2.5% based on how zakat is computed. And to the extent of 49, which is the foreign shareholder, you will pay tax and 20%. So it's a dual system, one of the very few countries in the world which has a dual system of corporate tax. So that's very important when you go into Saudi to determine, am I even allowed to go 100% based on what I think Lee and Wayne mentioned? Am I allowed to go 100% into Saudi foreign owned, especially for maybe Australian companies or UAE companies? Or if I mandatorily need a Saudi shareholder, do I then look at other ways of structuring? And probably one of the points which Lee touched upon is that if I go through the ADGM, whilst the ADGM may be 100% foreign owned company, there are certain rules in Saudi which track back to the ultimate beneficial owner. So if that's eventually Saudi, you still go under zakat. Probably the next question that may come up is on the global minimum tax, right? Suppose now if someone's applicable to zakat, they're paying tax at 2.5% and the global minimum tax rules come into effect within the next 12 months, 1st of Jan 23, what happens? The rules are not fully out, commentary is expected, but what we're expecting is all companies which have a turnover of over 750 million euros, like groups with consolidated turnover, will be covered under this. So there's a possibility that even Saudi and GCC shareholders who today pay 2.5% tax, eventually the company might end up paying a 15% global minimum tax. So that's a very important cash flow impact that you need to factor in when you're going to the Saudi, probably from 1st of Jan 23, if the commentary supports that. Moving on to withholding tax, Saudi, there's a withholding tax on most payments that you make on dividends, royalty, management fees. Management fees are probably the highest. It's about 20%. For the UAE, the good part is if you have treaty benefits, your royalty comes down to 10% and interest comes down to 0%. So that's specific to treaties. Unfortunately, Australia and KSA do not have a tax treaty, so you can't really reduce your rates. There are certain interest deductibility rules, which, like, if you have debt in your company in Saudi, not all the interest you pay is deductible against your profits. So either on your actual expense or there's a very complicated formula, which I don't want to go into the technicalities of it, but generally there are interest limitation rules in most parts of the world, and Saudi is also one of them with the same. Capital gains tax, Saudi is one of the few countries, like unlike the US, which doesn't impose non-resident capital gains tax, and India imposes a non-resident capital gains tax. Saudi also imposes a capital gains tax on non-resident. So let's say in the example that I've provided, if the non-GCC shareholder sells shares in the Saudi company, he pays a tax at 20%, which is the corporate tax rate. There are exemptions for listed company shares. If you sell shares either on the Tadawul or however you pronounce that, or on Saudi entities which are listed overseas, you can be exempt. But I think Saudi is one of the few countries which do not provide any exemptions for capital gains. So that's one extra cost if you're looking at Saudi. Next slide, please. I think I won't go too detailed into this because I guess Wayne and Lee have captured this appropriately. The only point from a tax perspective is it's better if you look at an LLC as against a branch. The main reason is because a branch has certain deductions which are denied, like royalties, loan charges that are paid to the head office. They are denied as deductions. And a branch of a foreign company is taxed exactly the way a foreign company will be taxed. So it will be taxed at 20%. So therefore, in terms of the activities that a branch can do, you're not getting too much of flexibility by operating through a branch unless it's a one-off contract. You don't want to set up the entire company. The setup may be easier for a branch, but from a tax perspective, due to certain force of attraction rules. Now, again, I don't mean to go into technicalities, but force of attraction rules essentially are, if you're undertaking similar activities as the parent, there are certain provisions in the tax law which just drags all your income to tax. There are no exemptions. There are no reliefs for income that you're earning on trading of goods. So therefore, between a branch and a parent and a company, from a tax perspective, generally we recommend an LLC unless there are compelling reasons why you should not go under an LLC if it's a one-off contract. Certain international tax considerations, again, I briefly touched upon this. KSA has about 50 tax treaties. Unfortunately, Australia is not one of them. US is neither one of them. UAE has a treaty. A very important point under this is you can get relief under tax treaties, but unfortunately, the tax authorities in KSA are extremely aggressive and not the most cooperative. Our experience for clients has been that even though they get the tax residency certificate, even though they have substance, the tax authorities are not honoring tax treaty reliefs. What typically happens is there are two ways to claim a tax treaty relief. Either you apply for something that you call a Form Q7B and you get a lower treaty rate. Now, the problem there is the practicality is that the Form Q7B is issued by the government. You almost never get it on time. So the other option is you apply the domestic rate of withholding, which is higher, and then you apply for a refund under the treaty. And the practicality of this is the refund takes time. So whilst, yes, there are treaties, but the practical challenges of claiming treaty benefits is fairly high. They have a very strange concept of a virtual permanent establishment. Now, for those, just for the benefit of those who are not tax folks here, a permanent establishment is essentially a presence by a foreign company or a person in Saudi or in any other country. So just take an example, you have an Australian company, but there is a person who's located in Saudi, has a fixed place of work in Saudi. Even though he's not a part of a Saudi company, but he's a part of the Australian company, if he's located in Saudi and doing active work in Saudi, that I've oversimplified it, but that's a permanent establishment. Most treaties, including the Saudi tax law, the domestic tax law says that a permanent establishment is created only when you physically are located in Saudi. However, there is a recent amendment or recent circular within the Saudi tax authority saying that there's a concept of a virtual permanent establishment, to say that even though, let's say you have an Australian company having an employee who's located in England or in Australia themselves, but they're undertaking all their activities for the Saudi business, that can still be liable to tax. So it is essentially trying to seek to tax something which the global principles of tax do not generally seek to tax, but the Saudi authorities have become very aggressive. Now, the next obvious question will be, how do they even know about it? The way they go about it is, if you're having business operations in Saudi, if you're having, say, a Saudi client, how are you earning income from that? Do you have a person located outside the Saudi earning income for the Saudi client? And they've got enough kind of filings to unearth that. And the funny part is, a lot of times, virtual P is one example, but a lot of times what we are seeing, the GAZT or Zatka, I mean, they're interchangeably used. They are unfortunately departing from a lot of stated procedures in law and adopting a procedure of their own, which does not help the taxpayer. I mean, we were talking with a very large e-commerce player in the region, in the UAE and KSA, and I'm sure we all use them. They are faced with a situation where under the law, they were supposed to pay tax of X. And using the virtual PE provisions, which don't even apply to them, the Zatka is troubling them with a tax audit of a few $1 million. So to which even our KSA colleagues who are on ground talking to the Zatka and the GAZT have said that, look, it's unfortunate that they are not looking at the actual law, but kind of doing what they want to do, at least at the start. What this ends up doing is it lands you in a lot of uncertainty. So you don't really know what are the positions you need to take, what are the tax costs you need to factor, what are the overall business transaction flows you need to plan for, right? So that's one of the biggest challenges that we are seeing in the KSA tax environment, that the Zatka is not very cooperative. I mean, of course, the tax law is fairly sophisticated. You've got treaties, you've got all the good things of the international world, but the tax authorities are not very cooperative with the taxpayers. Other taxes, you have VAT of 15%, recently increased from 5%. I mean, I think Bahrain followed suit last year where they increased the VAT rate. No individual income tax like rest of the GCC, and you've got social security contributions for Saudi employees. Next slide, please. Sorry, Pooja, next. So I can talk through this. So the next slide essentially seeks to cover just what are the practical insights and the recent developments. The BEPS on the global minimum tax will be probably the most important that companies should be looking out for. It's important to note that this applies only to companies in excess of 750 million euro turnover. If you don't have that, you shouldn't be too worried about it. But what the BEPS, general BEPS policy also seeks to achieve, and I think in a country like Saudi, unlike the UAE, that's slightly a lesser of a concern, seeks to avoid any kind of shell companies, tax planning, where you just set up a company purely for tax reasons, because Saudi themselves have a fairly robust corporate tax system. Unlike the UAE, historically, I'll just digress a bit, but in the UAE, historically, people would come, set up companies, take the 0% tax rate, park a lot of profits. But what the UAE has been forced to do on account of BEPS is introduce two things. One is the corporate tax that we are talking about. And before the corporate tax from 2019, you have something called the economic substance regulations, which is in line with BEPS, which is a byproduct of tax, but it's not a tax. What it essentially tells is UAE companies undertaking certain activities need to have feet on the ground in UAE, need to have employees undertaking the activities in the UAE as against sitting somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Asia. You need to have board of directors physically meeting in the UAE. So all of this just goes to one end goal to say that you need to have reasonable substance. And this is for the UAE. In the Saudi, they are also signatories of the same global agreement. So therefore, they will adopt these rules, but I don't think there'll be separate rules where you'll have these kind of economic substance regulations, because it's fairly robust as a thing. I've spoken about the GAST being aggressive. Transfer pricing, transactions between related parties need to be at arm's length. Saudis recently adopted the transfer pricing provisions in its domestic tax law. One very important point under zakat, again, it's related but unrelated at the same time. Under zakat, any payments made to shareholders or even shareholders' relatives, so if there's an individual or even the individual's wife or son, are absolutely denied while computing your taxable base. So they are disallowed deductions. So zakat has a different tax base than the income tax provisions. The income tax provisions follow global laws. Zakat follows, it's more of a religion-based, region-based law, but zakat has this one provision which is in line with global laws in terms of discouraging related party payments. On the M&A, the zakat, the GAST has again issued certain M&A guidelines. I specialize in M&A. We are seeing a lot of M&A in the region, and that kind of emphasizes why we are here today, because we are seeing a lot of foreign companies go into Saudi, acquire entities in Saudi. As we speak, we've done a large cloud kitchen deal in Saudi. We are doing a large food deal in Saudi. We're doing a large deal in the tech space in Saudi. So a lot of, and these are all US clients, US or UK clients. So a lot of US and UK clients are going into Saudi. Yes, there is that bit of uncertainty. There's that bit of, I mean, whether it's easy to operate, but they are biting the bullet. In the M&A considerations, what we recommend is that do your due diligence, factor in the valuations appropriately, and more importantly, generally, M&A transactions need to happen at an expedited time frame. Saudi is probably not there. So you budget time if you're doing an M&A in the region. And lastly, I think, just as in the news, Saudi's gotten special economic zones. So, I mean, UAE has 45 free trade zones. Saudi's got its first. And we're expecting, hopefully, with the news, there'll be more. They will have special tax rates. They will have very similar processes to what's there in the UAE. So that's a space to watch out for. So I think, yeah, that pretty much wraps up my discussion, and over to you, Carl.
Thank you, Sumit, Lee, and Wayne. Now comes the fun part, Q&A. So if I could ask three gentlemen to make your way up to the stage for your grilling. Okay, so I thought I might open up with what I hope to be a curly one for you, Samit, and then we'll hand it over to audience questions. But I want to throw you under the limelight here. You just spoke about the virtual permanent establishment. For especially KPMG as an example, you're a services-driven firm. You're not trading widgets and physical goods. Do you see the application of such an idea as a risk for the services sector in the GCC specifically? Saudi's obviously, and you mentioned, quite aggressively trying to bring in the tax dollars or riyals. Do you see Saudi government potentially looking at the operation of services-driven industries in the GCC and trying to increase that taxable income?
No, and that's right, because to be very frank, the 15 minutes I spoke probably creates a virtual peak, because I'm talking about Saudi being in the UAE, so that's as live as an example can get. So what they're doing is they're looking at income statements, they're looking at foreign currency. I mean, they have all the details of foreign currency income and expenses, and anything linked to Saudi that they find in the tax return. And if it's a foreign company, they are issuing like pages of information requests to say that how are you delivering in the Saudi. I'll give you a classic example of the client I was talking about. They undertake an e-commerce business in Saudi and the UAE. They are based in UAE, headquartered here. All their folks are in the UAE. Now, when they want when the gas wanted to like look at the virtual P impact for them, they send them a note saying that, look, we know you're there in the KSA, we know you're there in the UAE, but all your head of tax, your VP, your CEO, they sit in the UAE. So you can't say that those guys are not looking at the KSA. I mean, the CEO is equally responsible for the whole group and he impacts the KSA. So you give me a timesheet of how much time the CEO spends in an 8-hour day between KSA and the UAE. I mean, that's the level of detail they're going to. And I mean, that's just one example. I mean, in terms of services companies, they will actually go to see that, prove to me that in an 8-hour day, he's spending 2 hours for KSA. If he's spending 2 hours for KSA, I mean, tax has very complicated rules of apportionment of profits to PEs. If he's earning profits of 100 in the KSA, what are his expenses? And therefore, if there's a net profit based on the calculations, you pay 20% tax. That's, I mean, it's not fun, but that's where it's headed to.
You've got a big smile on your face when you talk about it, so we know you love it.
More work for us.
So is there any questions from the crowd that anyone would like to ask? I'll keep going. Hopefully mine are worthwhile. Sorry.
Hello, this one's probably for Wayne. So there's a lot of registration processes to go through and a lot of accounts to monitor. Would a company in Saudi typically need their own PRO?
It's a very good question. I think in the typical approach that I've seen with international companies and investors setting up in Saudi is to hire the first employee as a Saudi national that will undertake such duties. I suppose the challenge then is does that individual have the knowledge and contacts required at those government authorities to get that done successfully and efficiently? So obviously with our business, it's becoming particularly popular to outsource those services because having that on the ground corporate service provider with a professional approach that can ensure that you get all the registrations done and also the ongoing obligations, of which there are many in KSA. So it is client choice. With the Saudiization, it's one to consider because clients will look at that potentially as using that as their first hire being the PRO, but they may want indeed, want to outsource those services to a provider that can get it done on the ground.
I think, Wayne, could you just elaborate further just in terms of what one would expect salary-wise, the type of individual that can be PRO or GLO in Saudi, just in terms of that extra detail, because it's quite different than UAE?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of variances in the remuneration, but I think because obviously a lot of the Saudi nationals know that is a typical need for foreign investors, that will generate a sort of a higher remuneration than you'd be accustomed to, say, here in the UAE for any PROs that you hire. And that again is another consideration for companies, because you may look at that as not to be as cost efficient as outsourcing it to a provider on the ground. But I've seen variances, Carl, to be honest, in the monthly remuneration there. Anything from 15 up to 45,000 Saudi riyals per month.
Perfect. Now over to you, Lee, and I'd very much like to see more questions coming from the attendees. No pressure, but would be good. So it's not just what's been going through my head. What would be the most common mistakes that you've seen in terms of structuring? So you touched on the anti-concealment. I think there are quite a few companies that are having to look at how they have entered the market and how they need to adjust. But even from your initial discussions, when a client is talking to you about setting up in Saudi, quite often we see ideas planted in someone's head that the friend down the street's cousin came up with. They heard someone else has done before. What seems to be the common thread that you correct either before or after?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think a key one here is it's sort of getting that early stage advice to understand why you do structure in a particular way. So often I'll see people come to me and saying, oh, my friend told me to go and get a Ras Al Khaimah holdco or a JAFSA holdco, and then that's going to hold my Saudi. Now, for those of you that have been experienced sort of the structures here in the UAE, you'll find that the reason why I mention sometimes DIFC or ADGM is for a lot of us, we're probably more aware of the benefits of common law structure in terms of clarity around legal protections. So when you spend a lot of money and time doing shareholders agreements or arrangements with partners, it's all about the enforcement. It'd be like having an insurance policy that when you actually try to trigger it, it doesn't pay out. And so actually structuring correctly and making sure that it's there for a very good reason that it works is key. Now, Ras Al Khaimah or JAFSA, they're perfectly fine free zones, but they still come under UAE companies law, which means your onshore courts is where you're going to hear a dispute. Whereas when you go to ADGM, for example, you've got your own courts there under English law that can hear and not only hear the particular case, but actually enforce the judgment on the same floor. So go to the registrar and enforce it. So this comes back to a structuring point. The other one, obviously, is to not even have a holding company and go straight in and go into a local company as a perfectly normal joint venture partner, have the documents done often under Saudi law, and then not really seeking advice around what this might mean. And then when, say, there is an issue, you're sort of a bit of a fish out of water. You're now relying on local counsel in Saudi to advise you on Saudi courts and Saudi matters to try and enforce some rights. It's expensive, it's timely, and particularly if you don't speak Arabic, you'll already be in a situation where you'll be on the back foot. So again, it's just before you go in there, just some steps before to think about your structuring and why. Not because someone's just telling you because they're trying to sell you something, it's actually for good reason. It's just making sure that you're taking these steps because you've got to assume you're doing it to give yourself the robustness for all the kind of particular outcomes that could come from setting up in a foreign jurisdiction.
Perfect. Thank you. Anyone got fantastic?
So Lee, just on that, what's the most common structure you've recently seen? Like recurring?
Yeah, so the common one is through ADGM holding company through an SPV. Now, remember, I'm not just because I'm just sort of pumping ADGM here. You've heard of Cayman, BVI. There's lots of different structures you can. It was touched on that the benefit of ADGM is that because it is GCC and the relationship and the double tax treaty between the two countries is that it's just a little bit clearer between those two countries and recognized easier. They are cracking down on the BVI and Cayman structures, right, as everyone is until they start getting back up higher up into the sort of probably paying tax. So that seems to be the most common one. Historically, many years ago, there was a concept of what we call a SPC and DIFC, but it's less used. It was often done through finance structuring, but it's becoming increasingly harder to do it through DIFC. And so ADGM is probably your best option for a regional structuring setup.
Just one question for Wayne. Are there similarities between opening in Oman and opening in Saudi and operation in Saudi and Oman?
I think similarly across the GCC countries, there are certainly some similarities. One would be, Leo, the standard documentation from the foreign shareholder typically has the same type of documents. The content can slightly vary, of course, in terms of the resolutions, power of attorneys, constitutional documents. In comparing between the two sort of high level, I would say that Oman is certainly quicker, a little bit more fluid in terms of actually setup. Time frame and investment certainly would be different compared to KSA. You have a similar program there with the Saudization, Omanization, if I can say it. They're quite similar, different criteria, but certainly applied much more sort of stringently from the inception of the business, as opposed to say here in the UAE. But I think, yeah, sort of time frame and investment certainly would be significant differences between Oman and KSA.
Question for Samit. You mentioned about this personal virtual, or I can't remember the virtual. Yep. I've seen that it's been happening in the past for many, many years. So how the Saudi are knowing about it, or what is the, you mentioned they're doing it illegal now?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. So the question is that, you know, the personal virtual in Saudi, I know that we have an entity in Dubai and the people are working there, staying there. So how Saudi government is cracking on those?
So that's what I said. So if you have a foreign, so if you have Saudi operations, that's it. There are two scenarios here. You have an entity in Saudi, scenario one, and you have overseas operations as well. If the Saudi entity is reporting intercompany transactions with its overseas related parties, and obviously this impacts only related party payments because it won't tax you for being a customer abroad. In that case, it will probably go ahead and say that, okay, fine, I am earning X revenue from Saudi. Do I have those many employees in Saudi? So it boils down to something like in Dubai, the economic substance regulations is a byproduct of that. Earning $1 million in Saudi, but I have 2 employees. I mean, probably doesn't tie up. Then they go into a situation where, okay, then does your Dubai holdco, does your Australian holdco have people sitting there who are actually doing Saudi work, who normally should have been in Saudi, and once they are in Saudi, they actually create a P, or they are actually employed. So that's one level of thought. Second level of thought is scenario 2 is if you don't have a Saudi entity at all, you have a Dubai-based company undertaking operations in Saudi. They also have access. I mean, if you're undertaking operations in Saudi, which means you have some customers in Saudi, that's obviously unrelated. They also have access, and we know this because we are involved in the assessments and audits. They have access to saying that, okay, the customer is paying a non-resident vendor. How is that non-resident vendor really dealing in Saudi, right? I mean, someone needs to come down. Now, is that person coming down to Saudi? I mean, the threshold is generally 183 days, but for virtual P, unfortunately, the practical nuances, they are not honoring the 183 days. They are saying you're doing any operations in Saudi by sitting on a desk in Australia or the UK, you pay proportionate tax on that. So the unfortunate part is that they haven't made a lot of, there are no judicial precedents on the virtual PE as yet, but they are cracking down on it through different means and through different ways. And for them, commencing an audit is not that difficult because they just need to issue a notice to you. And me as a taxpayer, it's the onus is on me as a taxpayer to prove that I don't have a presence in Saudi. So that's how they're going about doing it. But I don't think there's too much of judicial precedent because it's fairly new, and they're, in fact, this is a tax circular that's been circulated internally with the tax officer saying crack on this. So it's a slight departure from the domestic law as well.
Hi, a question for Wayne, please. You were talking about one of the steps for the pre-incorporation is setting up the bank account so you can deposit the share capital. I mean, not wanting to draw comparisons, but banking here is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to incorporation. What's your experience in Saudi?
Similar. Sorry. I think in terms of opening the account in the pre-incorporation phase, when there's a minimum capital required at that stage, that's not a particularly onerous process. But of course, when it comes to operating the account, which you can, and just to sort of flag there for those activities that need that minimum capital, that can be used as working capital when the company is operated. It's not a minimum that needs to stay in there for the life of the company, so it can be used as working capital. But I think a similar process would be my answer to that in terms of KYC, due diligence, timeframe challenges would certainly be consistent in Saudi as it is here in the UAE. That's a very good question. I would say it's very similar. Yeah.
Hi, question for Wayne as well. I find the requirement for 30 million riyals in share capital is extremely high for entry, especially when they're talking about SMEs potentially entering the market.
I think for any business in the trading sector would say the same. And I think that it's going to be very interesting moving forward to see if that's going to be addressed. The reason for that was to, of course, monitor the influx of foreign investment into Saudi. And they felt that criteria would be able to control who was going into the market. But I think it's a very good point. I think that is shared by many investors that we speak to. That's a significant investment within the trading sector. And with all the changes that have occurred in KSA in recent times, it will be interesting to see whether that is repositioned moving forward.
Sorry, just on that point as well, ironically, if you were a tech entrepreneur and you came in as a startup, and you had an underlying product and you came in via a tech innovation license, that requirement isn't there because they're trying to promote early stage innovation. Now, that doesn't mean that you go and say, I have a Shopify account, therefore I'm a tech person, right? That's not going to fly, but it is about the whole idea of innovating, because ultimately when you think of, you think of a lot of the products that you see, like the companies that have expanded, whether it's Noon or that, it is ultimately a tech company. It just has an underlying operations in the background. Uber, Careem, all these sort of tech startups have got through by innovation licenses in Saudi, and then they've grown out.
Just a question for the panel about free zones there. Obviously we've seen the first one sort of spring up, and then we've got the King Abdullah Financial Centre, which has been there for 1,000 years, and really not a lot's happened with that. What's the panel's thoughts on, the Saudi embracing that free zone type model, and particularly mentioned to the financial free zones?
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely coming. I think the reason why it's taken so long is some of the challenges in relation to the constitution. So I think these are like all these things, a lot's happened in the last 3 years, as we all know, and it's happened very rapidly. But in order for this to happen to the extent that it goes here, because remember, even if you look at the UAE, there are 3 types of sort of zones. It's offshore free zone, so ADGM DFC, onshore free zone being the 52 that we know about. And then there's onshore. Over there, the concept of just getting a free zone, that's one thing, and they might be able to change tax ruling. But when you get to a stage where you're going to circumvent and have maybe your own company's law, so starting to have better systems, and then potentially even have a court there that would adhere to those particular laws, that requires constitutional change. And so, as we all know, these things, they've done a lot in a few years. How quickly can they move on that? I think it's all in the works. It's just going to take some time, I think, but it's coming. It's coming.
Okay, Lee, just jumping back to the previous topic. So what you're saying is that if you try to enter the market, perhaps with an innovative app, even if you're a traditional trading company, but you entered that way more as an e-commerce play, then you could circumvent that requirement.
Yeah, you can. And obviously I don't want to go through the anti-concealment I just spoke about. No, I'm just saying though that, no, the idea is they're looking for innovation. They're looking to and a lot of innovation is about setting up some kind of technology like you just mentioned and expanding regionally. And they're looking at that kind of side of things. Absolutely. Yeah, you can go there. But again, it has to be just using tech and saying I have a computer and a website is not enough. It really, you have to show something, but a lot of people are doing it. And if you look at a lot of businesses that we're probably all users of, you'll notice that they started as innovation tech licenses. But ultimately, like if you look at any of the businesses that we probably order any of our InstaShop or anything, it's a tech company, even though fundamentally it's just a digital front to buying your groceries.
It's very interesting. Thanks.
I think we'll just have one or two more and then we'll wrap up.
Just a quick question to Lee as well. We didn't really discuss about intellectual property, and I just wanted to have your advice about when you're planning to set your business to Saudi, what would you do in terms of intellectual property? Is it worth like registering your brand, protecting your brand? Is it well enforced in Saudi?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Two things actually. So intellectual property and then data protection. I'll touch on both of them. So intellectual property, as you know, IP is registered per jurisdiction. So even though you might have a trademark or a patent registered in the UAE, that doesn't necessarily mean direct enforcement in Saudi. It has to be registered in each country. The only times the exception of those rules are European Union. You do it once, it's through the European Union, same in the US, so right across the US. It's very expensive. Unfortunately, in Saudi and UAE, it's probably the most expensive two countries in the world to register IP. So you're looking at about $4,000 each country. But it is something that if you want protection, particularly on the Arabic name or the name, it is important, particularly if you're going to spend money on marketing or you have a brand that's worth protecting. Often I've seen, it's usually a mistake that people will take your name. They'll take the domain accidentally because they just thought of your name and they didn't know you existed. But again, once that happens, if you don't have a trademark in that country, you cannot stop them unless you can prove you've got a case that you have a brand in the UAE, for example. But again, it's a process. So that's on IP. So do I recommend it? Yes. If you really are serious about going in there, I think that's just one of those costs that you should be looking at protecting your brand. The second point is data protection. As you know, this is a really big topic in the region at the moment. The UAE coming out with its own federal data protection, ADGM, DIFC have that already, and Saudi has announced it's going to have its own data protection as well. What does this mean? It's about personal data. We've all probably received, a random phone call where our number and name has been sold to thousands of people. This is all about protecting this. It's protecting your identity. This is going to be a requirement where each country will have to have the concept of a data protection officer, someone who says that the data is being held and protected and under the laws of that particular country. If you're dealing with government in Saudi, they're enforcing that the data is kept in Saudi servers. And this is something that you would then have to deal with whoever is storing your data and ensuring that that data is being kept locally. Same with the UAE government. Okay, so it's all about localizing of data so they can protect it and make sure it doesn't go off-site. So just little things, if you're in that specific space around data, just keep that in the back of your mind that it is coming, and you will need to think about that from a compliance standpoint.
I think I have the last question. About 6 months ago, they came up with this law that would be applicable from, I think, 2024 to say that you had to be headquartered in Saudi Arabia in order to secure government contracts. Are you seeing really this happening? Are we really seeing a shift of headquarters generally, which have been perhaps in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, shifting or planning to shift in order to secure those agreements? Or are people trying to find ways around that? Is it going to be enforced? General thoughts on that?
That's a very, very, very good point, actually. And just to take it back slightly for a second, I think going back to considerations for entering the market, your target audience is obviously a very critical factor. And you mentioned their end users being, if your end user is a government client, first and foremost, setting up a legal entity in Saudi is without question going to be a need for businesses to contract with government entities in Saudi. In regards to the headquarters for the region, by 2024, I think the criteria is still to be sort of ratified. What I will say from my experience, that I'm aware of one major corporate that's indeed doing that is headquartered here in the UAE and is going to be headquartered in Saudi by the effective date, as you say, which is 2024. That's interesting. So I'm only aware of one example there. But in terms of as I say, the target audience, the business activity you're going to undertake are two critical factors for securing contracts in the kingdom. And if that end user is a government entity, setting up a legal entity in KSA is a must. If it's with private sector companies, we've seen traditionally the sort of fly-in, fly-out model. But again, it's going to be interesting to see moving forward whether that's going to be sort of clamped down on from the Saudi authorities. And I think that with the drive at the moment and the changes that they've made, I think that their objective is to get investment into Saudi and to get foreign companies to set up their base in the region, whether that's as the headquarters or whether that's indeed just have an entity there to contract in the local market.
Perfect. I might squeeze one last question out of Sumit, if I can. This is very much a subjective view, looking into your thoughts here. There's been an announcement back in January from Saudi about a new foreign direct investment law. I believe it's being drafted and they're starting to get the PR teams pushing it out there. Do you have any thoughts as to where they might be heading with it in terms of that friendly competition between the UAE and the kingdom at the moment? Not, of course, wanting you to break any covenants you may have in place.
And to be honest, I could probably cite an example of probably an M&A transaction we just closed. So it's a US client looking at a Saudi target, and then they had a lot of teething issues going into this market. So purely because of the FDI law not being very robust, as I mean, I won't call UAE a very mature market, but let's take India, for example, where you have like a very robust foreign direct investment law. Because there were many issues in terms of changing licenses, changing shareholding, the visa license that you spoke about. So I don't think they've proceeded a lot on that, but I think it's very important that they act soon on it, because their peers, like UAE is an example, and I was talking with Wayne earlier today, they are moving fast on the FDI regime. So it's a question of if they don't, someone else will. And that coupled with the entire NEOM initiative and the Alula initiative, you have the world looking at Saudi today. I mean, we were talking about it. I landed in the Dubai airport 2 days back after my vacation, and it felt I've landed in the Saudi airport because all the ads were just Saudi of NEOM and Alula. So I don't think they've progressed a lot on it, but they should. And that's where I think there's a lot of interest in especially in the American market for Saudi targets, because they see a lot of, it's a question of they're getting targets at a cheap valuation where their internal rate of return will be pretty high. So I don't think they've moved that far, but they need to move that far, especially with the way the GCC is going.
Perfect, thank you. And on that note, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers today, Sumit, Wayne and Lee. Thank you so much for your insights. I'm very proud to say I didn't hear the word Giga Project mentioned once, which is quite unique for any Saudi conversation. So I think we earned a star there. But if I could please just ask the audience to give thanks to